I really want to thank you both for joining this part of the conversation. I invite you to stick around with us, and as we open up even to folks on the call. Does anybody else on the call have questions for Eric or Leticia? Is that Dean who has a question? Yeah.
My question, Dean. How has your work been received by local political and community leaders?
Okay, how's your work been received by local political leaders?
I would say, for example, the closest to me when it comes to politics, like our commissioner.
Yeah.
Her backyard is the maintenance shop, and her what she says, she's like, if the city says the air is okay, I'm not worried about it. And so they go by that, and I know there's some things that she should be concerned about, but you know, that's what she's gonna say. My city's telling me I'm fine, then that's okay.
You know, I'm very curious also for the folks with railroad background, the experience of being around diesel locomotives, has that been an issue for your coworkers? Go ahead, Fritz.
So let me just throw in a little bit from my direct experience. I've got about 40 years on the rail, most of that on or immediately next to diesel equipment. So I could say at one and the same time, I think that our general experience is that with the people who are the most exposed, the most effective, it doesn't come out being as dramatic as perhaps I'm hearing from you. On the other hand, it has been a central part of my work and my union in my location to deal with that question on several levels. And so, for example, we just finished the work that's necessary to extend a project that we spearheaded to take. You made reference to that type of locomotive that is only used in the switching yard.
Yeah. And
that type of locomotive is very different from what people normally think of when they think about trains going across the country and whatnot. Different in all sorts of ways, but most importantly in what its service demands are, which opens up some interesting possibilities. So over the course of time, we've tried a bunch of different technologies. We've tried some battery-related things. We ended up spearheading a project with the Metropolitan Area Council of Governments to take, we have in Washington, D.C., in the terminal situation there, total of about 9 of these kinds of switchers. We did a bunch of research and figured out that the best alternative for us in that situation was kind of a genset technology at this point. I guess you know a little bit about how that works.
No, go ahead. Can you explain that?
It's still a diesel operation, but instead of what happens on all locomotives at this point, which is that there's a huge diesel engine, usually in many cases it's pretty nearly the same equipment that's used on submarines, that goes online and stays online all the time. And throughout its service, throughout its duty cycle, it stays on all the time. What happens in these situations is sometimes they have no load at all, sometimes they have an extensive load, sometimes they have various different, and a lot of times they're just waiting. So it makes them ideally situated for a combination. It's kind of like, if you know how, I guess I would make sort of a weird analogy to farming, where you talk about integrated pest management, where there's not just one thing that you do, you do several different kinds of things to get the result that you're looking for. So we've just finished the necessary work to get an additional 3 of these locomotives converted. And the way that it works out in our situation is that every stakeholder in that project gets an advantage. Now, some people will say, well, it's still using diesel, and that's true, but it's using significantly less diesel. And not only is it using significantly less diesel, but the people who are most exposed to it, which would be the people who work on it and the people who are passengers that are around, have a significantly reduced exposure and a greater quality of life. It's been such a successful project. We did it with in combination with the Council of Governments through EPA grants, that it is one of the most, it will be the most advanced fleet of diesel locomotives on the Amtrak system, for example. Now, would I rather that we switch over to 100% electrified operation? Yeah, I would. That's not something that we're able to do right now for a bunch of reasons. And I mean, I think people are probably somewhat aware of the restrictions that passenger rail is under at this point.
Yeah.
I could answer a lot of other questions about that. I don't want to take away from your presentation. I want to say a couple of things, though, that I would think that it would be valuable for you to keep in mind. One is that the footprint of diesel operations in a rail yard is much greater than locomotives. And in other words, there's a lot of track equipment. There's a lot of stationary engineering kinds of equipment, generators, pumps, things of all those kinds of nature that run on diesel. And when we took the DC Department of Environment around our facilities originally, they were shocked that, you know, rock throwing distance from the nation's capital, there was this extensive footprint of diesel emissions that nobody in the public knew about. And the other thing is that, and you sort of touched on this, but I would say that, like, for example, we were really trying hard to have leverage to get the commuter agencies that run trains in and out of the city to switch to electrified operations. And one of the arguments that we made was that it's not real accounting. It's cooking of the books to say that running conventional or even slightly cleaned up conventional diesel locomotives over the road is cheaper. And the reason is because there's a whole aspect of their operation that they don't have to pay for. They slough it off onto the local communities. They slough it off onto whatever the host railroad is, things like that. So, for example, there's a whole commuter operations that bring people into Washington, D.C. from Virginia. When they get into D.C., they leave their locomotives running all day. And so even though it's for the benefit of people who live in Virginia, people who live in the District of Columbia get the product of that. And there's a cost that could be assessed to that. And essentially you could take a play from the, hopefully people won't mind my being a little bit partisan here and saying from the Republican playbook and saying that you have to use the real cost of things.
Wouldn't that be a nice thing for a change? Thank you for that, Fritz. I wanted to also just make sure that Leticia and Eric, that you could potentially respond to maybe what you've heard in regards to, is stuff that Fritz is talking about, stuff that and things that we've seen, the decarbonizing of the different equipment in the in the Port of Long Beach, for instance, that we've been lucky enough to be aware of through the Moving Forward Network and ECR Communities for Environmental Justice. Are you taking cues from them to see if are there ways that you can incrementally improve the health and the diesel impacts in the community?
Yes, the biggest opportunities, and I very much appreciate the comment a few minutes ago on sources of diesel from a rail yard, because in truth, the major source of diesel from a rail yard is trucks. And we've seen huge successes, especially in Oakland, California, in putting in place no idling rules, truck routes, keeping trucks out of neighborhoods, and of course, LA and Long Beach and enforcing upgrades to less polluting vehicles. That's not going to happen in Kansas City anytime soon. because of politics and a host of other factors. But the solutions are out there, and I think we'll get there in time. You know, the cost curve for renewable energies going down. The life cycle cost of a electric hostler truck or a yard truck, whatever you want to call it, is actually arguably anyway lower than diesel, and so that's going to keep happening.
Yeah.
So over time, this will get better. But of course, during that time, which maybe that's 50 years, a lot of children are going to get sick, and adults are going to die prematurely.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you both for bringing it home to such a real level with the communities that you work with, and I think it's a real great testament to this opportunity we're having together to be able to hear your experience and your work, and then also get folks like Fritz to be able to have ask questions and converse and share stories. I know, Tim, in terms of sort of transition to report back and closing out and just, answering a few questions and that sort of thing, didn't you have something you had to report, some news?
I actually, for my day job, I happened to be on a call earlier today with some folks from the EPA Office of Research and Development. And I understand that there actually is going to be some follow-up work in Kansas City over the next year approximately, with some monitoring where they're actually going to be looking at ultrafine particles and trying to characterize exactly what's going on in various communities there. So I hope that really does a lot of benefit for the Kansas City area in terms of understanding where the impacts are and trying to use that as further evidence for eventually regulating ultrafine particles in some way, although obviously I don't expect that to happen in this administration. But keep our fingers crossed so that maybe by 2021 we can do it.
Tim, thank you for sharing that. We've known for a couple of years that this was in the works from Region 7, but we've been told not to talk about it. So the fact that ORD is talking about it must mean it's moving along pretty well. That's great news. Thank you. And that was, I think it's fair to say, 100% an outcome of our monitoring in Kansas City, Kansas.
Fantastic.
Very good.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, our objective for Diesel Health Project was very modest, was to monitor. We found problems, throw a red flag on the field, tell BNSF what we wanted, notify EPA, and hope they did something. And I guess they're going to do something.
Well, thank goodness. Well, congratulations on that. Thank you for the great news, Tim. Anybody else have anything they'd like to share or question before we end it?
I have a quick request. Fritz, may I get in touch with you to learn more about what you're doing in DC?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I'd be glad to, because, it is one of our big concerns, and I didn't really speak to it earlier, but, my guys, and I was a representative for these people for years, that are they're on the very front line. They're the ones that they're right next to the smokestack and stuff like that, and the kinds of problems they have, really are easily measurable.
Thank you.
Yeah, I bet there's a lot of learning and sharing of information that could happen that hasn't yet happened, and it seems like this might be some of the seeds for that.
I have a question for Fritz. When you talk about how these polluting areas, rail areas, are right in the nation's capital, can you give us a little bit more information that might be part of some of the fuel in the fire, to use an inappropriate expression, in terms of an infrastructure conversation or convincing lawmakers to consider solutionary rail?
Well, as I said, when we, in the course of this project, with, my union, my unit actually decided that this was a critical thing for us. And we actually had other reasons besides just strictly speaking the health ones. We had some work-related reasons about the technical nature of what kind of equipment was going to be used to do the work that made us realize that we had to take the lead. So when we did, we took the EPA out and toured them all around, and then we took the Council of Governments people out, and we took the DC Department of the Environment people all around. And we had to really finesse it because the railroad, in this case it was Amtrak, they don't like stuff that they don't have control over. So that was a problem. So like your Kansas City yard is going to be somewhat different, but we have like 3 interconnected but big, huge areas. We have the actual terminal where passengers come and get on trains and things. Then we have what's called a coach yard, where a certain amount of trains are made up and serviced and things like that. And then we have a shop area. And there would be something comparable for that where you are as well. But the question is, how does it get all, because you said you have a marshalling yard and whatnot. So in each of those areas, there are different operations that are the majority of what goes on. So you could say if you looked at it from above and you had a way of censoring it or whatever, you'd end up with hot spots. You'd have hot spots in different places. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but and not just hot spots, but probably places where the actual pollutants are worse. Because, for example, a lot of the track equipment that's used in the maintenance of track and stuff is very poorly maintained. And as long as it continues to run, they'll keep using it. That was actually one of our driving forces for us, which was because of the EPA regulations. The EPA regulations say, you only have, you can grandfather a piece of equipment in and not have to meet the most stringent EPA guidelines for so long. But when that's true, you got a 50-year-old locomotive, which a lot of these switching locomotives are. In fact, all of them are. And those locomotives, it's not economical for the corporation to do anything to them other than just keep it so you can turn the wheels. So oil spewing, any of those kinds of things. So their notion is use it until it absolutely has to be scrapped. And it's going down, 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 down from everybody's point of view. They won't ever, do the right thing with it. And then they will replace it with whatever is cheapest. And this is why I emphasize to you the question of what is the balance sheet? What are the real costs? Because for them, they could say, well, it's cheap for us to go out and buy a off the rack diesel locomotive of whatever characteristics, but that's only true as long as they don't have to pay for the damage that it does.
Right, like if they're not having to pay for lawsuits or being considered a point source of pollution and then being regulated as such. So,
right.
So it seems like part of our job as a movement is to make it cost them.
What we were able to do was we were able to get tier 4 equipment in a place where they had tier 0. And with auto stop and start and with scrubbers and with a whole variety of other, that's like I say, it's integrated pest management. So, and here's another thing that will be important for you is that road locomotives are kind of a different situation. And the reason that is because they're designed to run at full power for the whole duty cycle of whatever it is they're doing, getting from point A to point B. They don't have stop and start and big demand and low demand and times where they're just waiting and things like that, or at least not as much. And that's why the approach that we've taken is very useful for switcher locomotives, but not very useful for road locomotives.
But it's very,
and that's been
right.
good on road locomotives, but the savings are not as great.
Uh-huh. All right. Well, we're getting a little bit in the weeds, I think, and but I do think that the differentiation of the for folks who are at the next to the switch yards and these maintenance yards is significant. But as Eric said, the biggest I want to just remember that the biggest impact is the trucks. So, a big impact is the trucks too. So there's a certain things that we can achieve in at the yard level, but it also feels like it also forces us to, I think, remember the big picture as well, and that if we're having the more trucks we have, the more long haul trucks and medium haul trucks we're dependent upon, the more trucks and more we're going to continue to be concentrating things at the yard, because not just exclusively because of the locomotives and the machines in the yard, but also because of these the interaction with the intermodal truck facility. It's not to take one thing away from another, but just to remember that there's a variety of fronts that we have to be fighting on here.
Your point is good, but like I say, it's basically that there is no one size fits all.
Right.
And actually, that's even true when we talk about electrification, because electrification will take care of locomotives, but it won't take care of any of the other stuff.
Right. So it's not just about electrifying them. We have to stop this process of concentrating the impacts in a community like Kansas City and Argentine by creating a system where they're not bringing in some ridiculous number of thousands of trucks per day.
But I would just say, for the folks that are really focused, and this is their main work that they're doing is on diesel emissions, you have both a carrot and a stick that's potentially available to you. And, the stick, of course, is increasing the cost to the railroad for doing the same thing the way that they have been. But the carrot is they can get stuff done with OPM, other people's money, which is that's actually the way you win them over from that position that you described earlier, where you said that they say, well, we'll come to your meetings, but we're not going to do anything. And so it's it's in part, it's like, okay, on this hand, we're going to make sure that you get dinged for your impact, and on this hand we're going to give you money. So
the website for Diesel Health Project and Clean Air Now is cankc.org, cankc.org.
There's a beautiful video there that if you didn't see it on the invitation, we encourage everybody to have a look, and it's recent. It's from this spring.
All right, all. We're over time now, and I just want to thank you all for participating. Thank you, Diane, for coordinating these amazing guests. So wonderful to see you both again since Houston, and thank you for taking so much time and your generous sharing, and everybody for your generosity of time and sharing. So thank you. I hope you have a lovely couple of weeks, and I look forward to circling back with folks as they can.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you to our guests. Have a good evening.
Thank you all.